my baby!
Imagine spending years despising someone with every part of your being. Imagine waking up every single day carrying resentment toward one person, believing with absolute certainty that they were the reason your life kept falling apart. Every argument, every betrayal, every painful memory becoming another brick in the wall separating the two of you. And then imagine discovering, after years of anger and destruction, that the person you hated more than anyone else in this world was never supposed to be your enemy at all. They were your family. They were connected to you long before either of you ever spoke your first words. And by the time the truth finally came out, both lives had already been permanently changed in ways neither of them could ever undo. For nearly 3 decades, Claire Bennett and Ethan Bennett believed they were complete strangers whose lives had collided by terrible coincidence. They fought with a level of bitterness most people reserve for people who have caused unbearable pain. Friends who knew them separately could never understand why the tension between them felt so intense from the very first moment they met. It was immediate, instant dislike, the kind of hostility that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching from the outside. Every conversation between them turned into conflict. Every attempt at cooperation became another battle. It was as if something buried deep inside both of them had recognized the other long before their minds ever had the chance to understand it. And for years, neither of them had the slightest idea why being in the same room with each other felt impossible. But what makes this story even harder to understand is that neither Claire nor Ethan were ever supposed to grow up apart. The truth began 28 years earlier, inside a hospital room where a young mother faced a decision no parent should ever have to make. A decision shaped by desperation, fear, and circumstances far beyond her control. Somewhere in those few terrifying hours after giving birth, 2 lives that should have remained side by side were quietly separated forever. Records were altered. Papers disappeared. Promises were made that would never be kept. And while 2 newborn children were carried away in opposite directions, nobody could have imagined that decades later those same children would unknowingly cross paths and begin tearing each other apart, without understanding why their connection felt so deeply personal from the very beginning. The tragedy here was never simply that 2 siblings were separated. Stories like that happen more often than most people realize. What makes this case extraordinary is what happened after fate brought them back together. Because unlike stories where long-lost family members reunite in emotional embraces and celebrate the miracle of finding one another, Claire and Ethan's reunion happened under completely different circumstances. There was no joy, no recognition, no emotional connection pulling them together. Instead, there was resentment from the very first encounter. The kind of resentment that grows sharper with every passing month. The kind that turns professional rivalry into something deeply personal. The kind that leaves scars long before anyone understands where those feelings are coming from. And the terrifying part is this. Somewhere along the way, their hatred stopped being ordinary conflict. It became obsession. People around them began noticing that something about their relationship felt strangely intense. Coworkers whispered about it. Friends questioned why they reacted so strongly to each other over situations that normally would have been forgotten in hours. Family members noticed changes in behavior. Ethan became angrier. Claire became emotionally withdrawn. Neither of them could explain why interactions that should have been minor disagreements somehow felt overwhelmingly emotional. It was almost as if something inside both of them was reacting to a truth neither one consciously knew existed. A truth hidden so deeply in the past that uncovering it would eventually expose a secret much larger than either of them could ever imagine. And what nobody understood at the time was that the answers weren't hidden in their present. The answers were waiting inside a forgotten chain of events buried nearly 30 years earlier. In records nobody had examined. In decisions made by people who assumed the consequences would disappear forever. In a system built on secrets powerful enough to permanently alter entire families without leaving obvious traces behind. Claire and Ethan had spent their entire lives unknowingly carrying the consequences of choices made by strangers before either of them was old enough to even understand the world around them. And by the time those consequences finally reached the surface, years of damage had already taken place between two people who should have spent their lives protecting each other instead of becoming enemies. Now, before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because stories like this remind us that sometimes the truth can remain hidden for decades, quietly shaping lives from the shadows until one single moment changes everything forever. And what happened to Claire and Ethan is proof that the past never stays buried forever, no matter how carefully someone tries to hide it. To understand how this entire nightmare began, we have to go back to Chicago in the spring of 1994, where Claire Bennett entered the world under circumstances she would spend most of her adult life trying desperately to understand. Raised in a comfortable suburban home by adoptive parents who gave her every opportunity imaginable, Claire lived what most people would consider a stable childhood. She had good schools, supportive parents, financial security, and a future filled with possibility. But despite having everything many children dream of, there was always one question quietly living inside her mind. Why had her biological mother given her away? It was a question she carried for years, a silent wound she rarely spoke about. Every birthday reminded her there was a missing piece to her story somewhere out there in the world. 300 miles away, another child born on that exact same day was growing up under completely different circumstances. Ethan Bennett was raised in a modest home outside Indianapolis by parents who never once told him the truth about how he entered their lives. Unlike Claire, Ethan never knew he had been adopted. He grew up believing his childhood was ordinary, but something always felt strangely disconnected inside him. He had a temper nobody understood. Relationships never lasted. He struggled with feelings he couldn't explain, carrying frustration that followed him into adulthood. Friends often described him as intense, unpredictable, and emotionally reactive in situations where most people remained calm. Ethan himself couldn't understand why anger seemed to live permanently beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest excuse to come rushing out without warning. For 26 years, these two lives moved separately through the world, connected only by DNA, and a truth carefully hidden from both of them. Claire pursued education aggressively, eventually building a successful career in corporate marketing where discipline and precision became part of her identity. Ethan moved through several jobs before finding his strength in business development, where confidence and persistence helped him rise quickly despite his difficult temperament. Neither knew the other existed. Neither had reason to suspect there was someone else living an entirely separate life, carrying the exact same biological history. But fate has a strange way of bringing unfinished stories back together. And sometimes the reunion comes in forms nobody could ever prepare for. It happened in New York City in the fall of 2022 when both Claire and Ethan independently applied for the exact same executive position at one of the fastest growing media companies in the country. Hundreds applied. Dozens were rejected. Through sheer coincidence, both made it to the final stage of interviews scheduled on the same day inside the same corporate office overlooking downtown Manhattan. Neither knew that walking into that building would quietly begin the chain of events leading to one of the most devastating discoveries either of them would ever face. Because sometimes life doesn't reveal truth gently. Sometimes it places two people directly in each other's path and waits for everything hidden beneath the surface to begin tearing itself apart. The moment Claire first saw Ethan standing across that conference room, something inside her shifted immediately. She couldn't explain it. He hadn't spoken a word yet, but irritation hit her so strongly, she physically felt uncomfortable standing near him. Ethan experienced the exact same reaction. Before introductions were even finished, both had already formed instant dislike toward one another with a level of emotional intensity that made no logical sense whatsoever. It was immediate tension unlike anything either had experienced before. Neither understood why a complete stranger had managed to trigger emotions usually reserved for people connected to deeply personal memories. Yet somehow, within seconds of meeting, both instinctively felt something powerful pulling them into conflict. And neither could have imagined that this first encounter was only the beginning of something far bigger waiting ahead. What happened next would become the beginning of a conflict neither Claire nor Ethan would ever fully understand until years of damage had already been done. The interview process that day should have been routine. Two qualified professionals competing for a high-level executive role, answering questions, presenting strategies, proving why they deserved the position more than everyone else in the room. But almost immediately, something unusual happened. During the first roundtable discussion, Claire interrupted Ethan twice while he was presenting his market expansion proposal. The interruption itself was minor, the kind of professional disagreement that happens every day in corporate settings across America. Yet Ethan's reaction was immediate and unusually sharp. His frustration rose so quickly that even the interview panel noticed the tension forming between two people who had known each other for less than 30 minutes. Claire herself couldn't explain why hearing Ethan speak irritated her so deeply. It wasn't his ideas. It wasn't his confidence. Something about his presence alone seemed to trigger an emotional resistance she had never experienced with anyone before. The strange part was that Ethan was experiencing exactly the same internal conflict. Later, he would admit that from the very first moment Claire began speaking, he felt an overwhelming urge to challenge everything she said. It was irrational, illogical. He could recognize that himself, yet the feeling remained impossible to control. Every sentence she spoke somehow felt personally offensive, even when she was addressing completely neutral topics. Observers in the room later recalled how unusual the atmosphere became. The hiring director eventually had to redirect the discussion several times because Claire and Ethan kept finding reasons to undermine one another in front of the panel. Neither cared anymore about making a good impression. Both had become focused entirely on defeating the other. By the time interviews concluded, people inside the company were already quietly discussing the bizarre hostility they had witnessed between two strangers who had absolutely no known history together. 3 days later, the company made a decision nobody expected. Instead of choosing one candidate, management decided to hire both Claire and Ethan, assigning them to lead separate divisions inside the same executive department. What should have been exciting news immediately became the beginning of a long and exhausting war. Neither welcomed the announcement. Neither hid their disappointment. Claire privately told a colleague she had no interest working alongside someone as confrontational as Ethan Bennett. Across the building, Ethan was making similar complaints, insisting management had made a serious mistake allowing Claire into a leadership role. Yet neither had the authority to challenge the decision. So both accepted the new arrangement, unaware that the next several months would slowly transform ordinary workplace conflict into something much more destructive than either could anticipate. At first, the disagreements remained professional. Meetings turned competitive. Emails became increasingly hostile. Both started deliberately questioning the other's judgment during executive discussions. If Claire proposed a new campaign strategy, Ethan immediately criticized the projected numbers. If Ethan introduced new growth initiatives, Claire aggressively challenged his planning assumptions in front of senior leadership. Colleagues quickly noticed that no matter what subject was being discussed, somehow the conversation always ended with Claire and Ethan directly opposing one another. What confused everyone was the intensity behind their reactions. This was far beyond ordinary competition between ambitious professionals. Neither behaved this way toward anyone else inside the company. Yet every interaction between them seemed to produce immediate conflict. It was becoming impossible for others not to notice. Over the following 6 months, the tension escalated in ways that began affecting both of their personal lives. Claire, normally calm and emotionally disciplined, started bringing work stress home in ways her friends found concerning. She became increasingly isolated, turning down invitations, sleeping poorly, obsessively replaying arguments she had with Ethan during the workday. She couldn't explain why someone she barely knew had managed to consume so much of her mental energy. Friends encouraged her to ignore him, reminding her that difficult coworkers exist everywhere. But Claire couldn't let it go. Something about Ethan felt deeply personal, even when logic told her he was simply another executive competitor. The frustration stayed with her constantly, lingering long after every interaction ended. Meanwhile, Ethan was beginning to experience similar behavioral changes. His temper, already difficult throughout much of his adult life, became noticeably worse. Small disagreements at work triggered explosive reactions far beyond what situations normally required. He found himself constantly thinking about Claire, replaying conversations in his head, analyzing every disagreement long after leaving the office. It frustrated him deeply because he had never experienced this kind of emotional fixation before. Relationships outside work began suffering. Friends noticed he was becoming more aggressive. Conversations frequently returned to complaints about Claire Bennett. What started as professional competition had somehow transformed into something far more consuming. Even Ethan himself admitted privately that the level of anger he felt toward her made absolutely no sense. Then came the incident that pushed everything into dangerous territory. During a quarterly shareholder presentation attended by major investors, Claire was scheduled to unveil a new campaign strategy projected to increase company revenue significantly. It was one of the most important presentations of her career. Weeks of preparation had gone into every detail. But moments before she began speaking, critical presentation files suddenly disappeared from the shared company server. The files had been deleted entirely. Panic spread immediately. Without those files, Claire stood in front of investors completely unprepared, forced to stumble through incomplete information while senior executives watched in visible disappointment. The presentation collapsed. Investors expressed concern. Senior management privately questioned Claire's competence. Within hours, rumors began circulating throughout the office. And almost immediately, Claire became convinced Ethan had sabotaged her intentionally. The accusation exploded later that evening inside the executive conference room. Claire confronted Ethan directly, demanding answers with a level of fury coworkers had never seen from her before.
You cannot do this to me!
It was your decision! You left me no choice!
That is a lie! You will pay for this!
Ethan denied everything. He insisted he had absolutely nothing to do with the deleted files. But Claire refused to believe him. Years later, witnesses would still describe the intensity of that confrontation. Voices rose. Profanity filled the room. Security staff outside heard shouting loud enough to stop employees in nearby offices. Ethan, equally furious over being falsely accused, retaliated by threatening to report Claire for harassment. Neither backed down. By the end of the night, company leadership formally documented the incident and issued warnings to both executives. Yet what nobody understood then was that this confrontation would quietly set into motion events that would begin uncovering truths buried nearly 3 decades earlier. Because unknown to both Claire and Ethan, that deleted presentation had not been removed by either of them. The company's cybersecurity team would later discover evidence suggesting an external system breach occurred only minutes before the files disappeared. Someone outside the company had gained temporary access to internal systems and deliberately targeted Claire's work specifically. At the time, investigators assumed it was random corporate sabotage connected to competitors. The case was logged, documented, and quietly forgotten after no immediate suspects were identified. But years later, investigators examining this case discovered something deeply unsettling. Whoever accessed the company system had searched 2 employee records before deleting Claire's presentation files. Not dozens of employees. Not broad company data. Just 2 records. Claire Bennett, Ethan Bennett. And whoever had done it clearly knew exactly who they were long before either of them understood the truth themselves. At first, nobody connected this breach to anything larger. But from that point forward, strange incidents surrounding Claire and Ethan began happening with increasing frequency. Anonymous complaints were submitted against both of them through internal company reporting systems. Personal information from their employee records somehow leaked online. A minor traffic accident involving Ethan occurred under circumstances local police later described as unusual. Claire received several phone calls late at night from numbers that disconnected immediately after she answered. Neither connected these incidents together. Both remained consumed by their growing hatred toward one another, believing each new problem was simply another act of retaliation carried out by the other person. The possibility that a third party might somehow be involved never crossed either of their minds. Months passed, and what had started as rivalry slowly became obsession. Claire secretly hired a private investigator to begin looking into Ethan's background, convinced there had to be something hidden beneath the surface explaining why he seemed determined to destroy her career. Ethan, equally suspicious, began conducting his own investigation into Claire's personal history, searching public records, old employment documents, and archived background information available online. Neither investigation revealed anything unusual at first. Ordinary childhoods, separate families, separate histories, no known connection, no mutual relatives, no reason whatsoever explaining the strange emotional intensity that existed between them. Yet despite finding nothing suspicious, neither could shake the growing certainty that somehow their connection ran deeper than simple workplace conflict. And then came the discovery that changed everything. While reviewing archived public documents connected to Claire's adoption records, the investigator Ethan Hired noticed something unusual buried inside county hospital documentation from Chicago dated May 19, 1994. Claire Bennett's adoption paperwork listed delivery time as 3:42 in the morning at St. Catherine Medical Center. The record itself seemed ordinary, but attached to the same hospital file was a partially corrupted administrative reference number connected to another birth recorded only 7 minutes later. Another newborn. Same delivery room. Same attending physician. Same exact last name listed on intake forms before adoption processing had begun. The second infant's file had been partially erased, but one detail remained visible. Male child. Last name Bennett. Birth time 3:49 a.m. At nearly the exact same moment, hundreds of miles away, Claire's investigator had uncovered something equally disturbing while reviewing Ethan's childhood records. Ethan's birth certificate had been legally reissued 6 months after birth under highly unusual administrative procedures. Several signatures on the document appeared inconsistent with state records from that period. More troubling still, the original hospital listed on Ethan's sealed records was the exact same hospital where Claire had been born. St. Catherine Medical Center, Chicago, Illinois. Same date. Same physician. Same delivery room registration code buried deep inside archived county documentation. Neither investigator fully understood what these records meant yet. But for the first time in nearly 30 years, evidence had quietly surfaced suggesting Claire Bennett and Ethan Bennett were connected by something far greater than anyone had ever imagined. And somewhere far away, a person who had spent decades protecting this secret was beginning to realize that the truth they had buried all those years ago was finally starting to rise back to the surface. For almost 30 years, the truth had remained buried beneath paperwork so carefully altered that nobody had ever thought to question it. Birth certificates had been modified, hospital archives quietly reorganized, signatures placed where they were never supposed to appear, and identities reassigned in ways designed to survive decades without attracting attention. What neither Claire nor Ethan understood at that moment was that their separate investigations had unknowingly opened a door someone had spent nearly 3 decades making sure remained permanently closed. Somewhere, a person connected to those events in 1994 had suddenly realized that 2 names once hidden inside forgotten hospital records were now being examined again. And for the first time in years, fear was beginning to spread among people who thought this story had ended long ago. Ethan was the first to receive the phone call from his investigator. At first, he assumed it would be another disappointing update confirming there was nothing unusual hidden in Claire's background. Instead, what he heard left him sitting in silence for nearly a full minute. The investigator explained that while reviewing Claire Bennett's adoption records, a hospital birth file from Chicago had revealed a second infant born within minutes of Claire on the exact same date. What immediately caught Ethan's attention was hearing the surname Bennett attached to both records before adoption processing had been completed. He interrupted several times, trying to understand how 2 completely separate individuals with no known connection could somehow appear inside hospital records connected by the same name at birth. The investigator admitted he didn't fully understand it himself, but strongly recommended digging deeper because something about the paperwork felt deeply irregular. Ethan ended the call shaken, though not yet understanding why hearing this information had triggered an overwhelming feeling of unease he couldn't explain. At almost the exact same time, Claire sat frozen in her apartment listening to nearly identical information from the investigator she had hired weeks earlier. Ethan's birth records had produced anomalies impossible to ignore. His original hospital documentation pointed directly back to St. Catherine Medical Center in Chicago, the same facility listed on her own adoption paperwork. More troubling still, his official birth certificate had been reissued months after birth under procedures rarely used in ordinary adoptions. Several state authentication records appeared inconsistent with county filing procedures from that time period. Claire immediately began asking questions, pressing the investigator for explanations he simply didn't have. Why would 2 strangers connected only by workplace conflict share identical birth hospital records from the same date, nearly 3 decades earlier? Why would Ethan's records show administrative irregularities so severe they suggested intentional alteration? And most importantly, why was the surname Bennett appearing inside records connected to both of them? For the first time since meeting Ethan nearly a year earlier, Claire found herself questioning everything she thought she understood about their strange relationship. She replayed every argument they had ever had, every confrontation, every irrational emotional reaction neither of them seemed capable of controlling. It suddenly felt impossible to dismiss the possibility that something far deeper connected them in ways neither had considered. Yet logic resisted the idea entirely. They had grown up in separate states, raised by different families under completely different circumstances. There was no obvious connection explaining why their lives had somehow become entangled decades before they ever met. And still, the growing pile of irregularities surrounding their birth records suggested one terrifying possibility neither was emotionally prepared to confront. Their connection may have started long before their first encounter inside that New York office building. The following morning, Claire arrived at work carrying documents she had spent most of the night reviewing. For the first time since meeting Ethan, anger was not the emotion controlling her thoughts. Confusion had replaced resentment. Questions now outweighed frustration. She knew confronting Ethan directly was dangerous given their history, but the information sitting inside the folder in her hands demanded answers. Across the building, Ethan had arrived carrying his own copy of hospital documents obtained overnight. Neither knew the other possessed nearly identical evidence. And by complete coincidence, both stepped into the executive elevator on the 42nd floor at exactly the same moment. The silence inside that elevator felt heavier than anything either had experienced before. Their usual instinct to argue disappeared completely. Something had shifted. Claire broke the silence first. Her voice, usually sharp whenever speaking to Ethan, carried uncertainty he had never heard before. She asked one question so quietly it barely sounded real. She asked if he had ever been born in Chicago. Ethan turned toward her slowly, stunned by what he was hearing. Without answering immediately, he reached inside his briefcase and removed several folded documents. Claire stared as he held out the same hospital name already sitting inside her own folder. St. Catherine Medical Center, Chicago, May 19, 1994. For several long seconds neither spoke. Their eyes moved between identical records confirming the exact same details both had independently discovered less than 12 hours earlier. It was the first moment either understood their connection could no longer be explained away as coincidence. What happened over the next several hours would permanently alter both of their lives. Instead of attending scheduled executive meetings, Claire and Ethan left the office together for the first time without hostility between them. They spent the entire afternoon comparing documents, timelines, hospital records, adoption paperwork, legal filings, and archived state records each investigator had uncovered. Piece by piece, a disturbing pattern began emerging. Same hospital, same birth date, same physician overseeing delivery, same surname attached before legal adoption processing occurred. Ethan's records showed unusual certificate replacement procedures 6 months after birth. Claire's records contained sealed adoption amendments issued under expedited emergency filing conditions never explained anywhere inside public archives. Every new discovery pointed toward one conclusion becoming harder to ignore with every passing hour. Late that evening, Ethan finally asked the question both had been avoiding all day. Could they somehow be related? The possibility sounded absurd even as the evidence mounted. Claire resisted immediately, insisting there had to be another explanation. Cousins perhaps. Extended family connections hidden through adoption paperwork. Administrative errors made decades earlier. Anything except the possibility silently forming in both their minds. Ethan himself looked visibly shaken, speaking the words aloud. Neither wanted to say what both were already beginning to suspect. Because if the documents were accurate, if hospital records were genuine, if signatures and birth data matched exactly the way investigators believed they did, then the hatred that had consumed nearly every interaction between them over the past year had existed between two people connected in ways neither had ever imagined possible. That same night, unknown to Claire and Ethan, someone else was watching events unfold from hundreds of miles away in Illinois. Inside a modest suburban home outside Chicago sat 73-year-old Margaret Holloway, a retired administrative supervisor who had worked at St. Catherine Medical Center in 1994. For years, Margaret had lived quietly, carrying memories of events she had spent decades trying desperately to forget. Earlier that afternoon, she had received a disturbing phone call from a former hospital colleague who still maintained access to archived administrative monitoring systems. 2 names buried inside sealed hospital records had been accessed repeatedly over the previous 48 hours. Claire Bennett, Ethan Bennett. The moment Margaret heard those names spoken aloud, blood drained from her face. She understood immediately what this meant. The secret was no longer safe. Margaret had spent nearly 30 years convincing herself the choices made inside that hospital all those years ago had been justified by circumstances no outsider could ever understand. Back then, St. Catherine Medical Center had been drowning financially. Certain administrators had quietly developed arrangements nobody officially acknowledged. Infants born under complicated circumstances sometimes disappeared into private adoption agreements involving wealthy families willing to pay enormous sums to avoid traditional waiting processes. Records were altered carefully. Parents were manipulated. Legal systems were bypassed through carefully coordinated paperwork changes few people ever questioned. Most cases remained hidden forever. Families moved on. Children grew up never knowing their histories had been rewritten before they were old enough to speak. Margaret believed those secrets would stay buried permanently. But now, hearing Claire and Ethan's records had resurfaced again, she understood something terrible was approaching. Back in New York, Claire and Ethan made a decision neither fully understood the consequences of making. If the truth surrounding their births had been hidden intentionally, they needed proof stronger than paperwork alone. Hospital records could be forged. Legal documents could be altered. Administrative signatures could be manipulated. There was only one method capable of providing certainty beyond argument: DNA testing. Scientific evidence impossible to erase or rewrite. Ethan contacted a private medical genetics laboratory operating overnight services for urgent family verification cases. An appointment was secured for the following morning. Neither spoke much afterward. The tension between them had changed completely now. Months of hatred had given way to something infinitely heavier: fear. The possibility looming between them felt almost unbearable. But what neither Claire nor Ethan knew was that less than 2 hours after scheduling that DNA appointment, someone had already begun making plans to stop those results from ever reaching them. Because buried inside the history of St. Catherine Medical Center was a secret far larger than 2 altered birth records. Claire and Ethan were never the only children affected. Their case had simply been one thread inside a system operating quietly for years, involving families who paid extraordinary amounts of money to acquire newborns through channels nobody was ever supposed to discover. Powerful people had spent decades protecting those secrets. Careers had been built on silence. Lives had been reshaped permanently by decisions hidden behind hospital walls. And now, as Claire and Ethan unknowingly moved closer toward discovering who they truly were, forces connected to their past were preparing to make certain some truths never reached daylight. Because sometimes uncovering the truth is far more dangerous than living without it. And by the time Claire Bennett and Ethan Bennett realized exactly what they had stepped into, the people guarding those secrets had already begun moving against them. There are moments when human instinct recognizes danger long before the mind fully understands it. That night, after leaving the private genetics laboratory appointment office in downtown Manhattan, both Claire Bennett and Ethan Bennett felt an uneasiness neither could explain. Less than 24 hours earlier, the two of them had still been consumed by resentment powerful enough to destroy each other professionally. Yet now, standing on opposite sides of a truth neither fully understood, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since meeting, neither saw the other as an enemy. Instead, both were staring directly into a mystery capable of rewriting every memory they had about their own identities. The anger that once defined their relationship had been replaced by silence, confusion, and a growing fear neither wanted to acknowledge aloud. Somewhere deep inside, both understood that whatever answers the DNA results provided, life would never return to what it had been before this moment. The private laboratory agreed to fast-track the analysis due to the urgency classification attached to family relationship verification testing. Under normal circumstances, results required several business days. In this case, preliminary genetic comparison could be completed within 18 hours. Claire signed the final authorization documents with visibly trembling hands. Ethan remained unusually quiet, pacing the waiting area while technicians collected samples. Neither exchanged many words during the process. There was no comfort between them yet. Too much history existed. Too many months spent hurting each other emotionally and professionally had left wounds impossible to erase overnight. But beneath all of that sat one terrifying possibility. If the records were telling the truth, then every year they had spent unknowingly fighting each other had been built upon a lie created before either of them had taken their first breath. Across the country, inside her Illinois home, Margaret Holloway had already begun making phone calls she never imagined she would need to make again. For decades, she had kept distance from everyone connected to what happened inside St. Catherine Medical Center during the early 1990s. Most had retired. Some had passed away. Others disappeared completely after investigators briefly examined unrelated hospital administrative complaints years earlier. Yet there remained a small number of people who understood exactly what had happened during those years and had every reason to ensure buried records remained permanently hidden. Margaret reached for a phone number she had not dialed in nearly 15 years. When the man on the other end answered, she spoke only 8 words before silence filled the line. She said, "They found the Bennett files again." Nothing else needed explanation. The man listening from the other end was Richard Mercer, former hospital legal advisor at St. Catherine Medical Center during the years private infant transfer arrangements quietly operated beneath ordinary adoption channels. Richard had built a successful legal consulting career after leaving Chicago decades earlier. Publicly, his reputation remained spotless. No criminal investigations had ever connected him to anything improper. Yet hearing Margaret mention the Bennett files immediately pulled him back into memories he had spent years making sure never resurfaced. He understood exactly why those names mattered. The Bennett case had always been considered uniquely dangerous because, unlike most infant transfers handled during that period, this particular birth involved twins. Splitting twins had never been standard procedure even inside their unauthorized operations. But in May 1994, circumstances surrounding one wealthy client's demand had forced decisions several hospital administrators deeply regretted even while carrying them out. Richard understood instantly that if Claire and Ethan discovered the truth, far more than one old secret could begin unraveling. The following morning in New York, Claire woke after barely sleeping 2 hours. Her entire sense of identity felt fractured. Every childhood memory suddenly carried questions she had never asked before. Had her adoptive parents known details they never shared? Why had her biological records always remained sealed with unusual legal restrictions? Why had she spent so much of her adult life feeling incomplete without understanding why? Across the city, Ethan experienced the exact same emotional collapse privately. For years he had believed unresolved anger simply reflected personality flaws he could never fully control. Now a disturbing thought had begun consuming him. What if that anger had roots connected to trauma beginning long before memory itself? What if feelings that shaped his entire adult life were somehow connected to events hidden inside a hospital room nearly 30 years earlier? Neither could escape the overwhelming realization that discovering the truth might explain far more than their strange connection to each other. At 11:23 that morning, the laboratory called. Preliminary results had finished processing earlier than expected. Claire and Ethan were instructed to return immediately. The 20-minute drive felt impossibly long. Neither spoke during the journey. The atmosphere inside the car carried tension unlike anything either had experienced before. Every possibility raced through their minds. Cousins, half-siblings, administrative coincidence somehow involving extended family history. Both desperately searched for explanations less devastating than the one possibility growing stronger with every passing second. By the time they entered the laboratory consultation office, even breathing felt strangely difficult. The genetics specialist waiting inside held a sealed report folder resting on the desk between them. His expression alone immediately told both of them that life as they understood it had just ended. The specialist began speaking carefully, explaining that family relationship DNA comparison testing had produced an exceptionally strong match impossible to dispute scientifically. Ethan leaned forward first, asking directly whether they were related. The specialist paused briefly before answering. Yes. The analysis confirmed with overwhelming certainty that Claire Bennett and Ethan Bennett shared immediate biological parentage. But he had not finished speaking. Claire immediately asked whether that meant brother and sister. Again, the specialist answered yes. Yet one final detail remained. based on identical chromosomal pattern markers appearing consistently across both genetic samples. Further analysis indicated something even more specific than ordinary sibling relation. The specialist looked directly at both of them before quietly delivering words that would permanently divide their lives into before and after. Claire Bennett and Ethan Bennett were not simply siblings. They were twins. Neither reacted immediately. The silence inside that office stretched almost unnaturally long. Claire stared blankly at the report sitting on the desk, unable to process what she had just heard. Ethan physically stepped backward, placing both hands against the wall behind him as if trying to steady himself. Twins. The word itself felt impossible. Every memory from the previous year suddenly began replaying differently inside both their minds. Every argument, every confrontation, every cruel insult spoken during months of hostility, every attempt they had made to sabotage each other professionally. Both had spent an entire year attacking the one person on Earth whose life had begun alongside their own. Neither could process the emotional weight crashing down around them in that moment. It felt less like discovering truth and more like watching reality itself collapse beneath their feet. Claire was the first to break emotionally. Tears came almost instantly, though she barely seemed aware she was crying. Her entire life had been shaped by questions surrounding abandonment she never believed would be answered. Yet nothing prepared her for discovering that somewhere in the world, another child born alongside her had been separated intentionally, while both grew up believing completely different stories about who they were. Ethan remained silent longer, though shock quickly transformed into visible anger unlike anything Claire had witnessed from him before. But this time, the anger was no longer directed toward her. It was directed toward whoever had stolen nearly 3 decades of truth from both of them. Because this was no accident. Twins do not simply disappear into separate lives through paperwork mistakes. Someone had made deliberate decisions. Someone had chosen to separate them. Back in Illinois, Richard Mercer received confirmation less than an hour later that DNA verification had already been completed. The message came through one of several old professional contacts who still maintained private access to medical notification systems. Richard sat motionless for several seconds, understanding immediately what this meant. The final barrier protecting the truth had fallen. Claire and Ethan now possessed proof impossible to dispute legally. Worse still, once two separated twins begin asking questions publicly, attention spreads quickly. Journalists become interested. Adoption records are re-examined. Historical hospital archives come under renewed scrutiny. Richard understood that if investigators began reviewing St. Catherine Medical Center records from the early 1990s, they would uncover far more than the Bennett case. Hundreds of sealed documents existed from years hospital administrators quietly arranged infant transfers under circumstances no court had ever examined properly. That afternoon, Claire and Ethan sat together inside a quiet coffee shop several blocks from the laboratory, neither fully able to speak normally. The hostility that once defined every interaction between them had disappeared completely, replaced now by grief, so overwhelming words felt inadequate. Claire kept staring at Ethan's face, noticing similarities she somehow never registered before. The shape of the eyes. Identical expressions forming unconsciously during moments of concentration. The subtle movement of the jaw when thinking. Ethan was noticing the same things. Features he had somehow overlooked despite spending nearly a year around her almost daily. The realization became harder to bear with every passing minute. The person he had spent months resenting more intensely than anyone in his adult life was never supposed to be a stranger at all. And then Claire quietly asked the question that changed everything again. If they were twins, where was their mother now? Ethan looked up slowly, the same thought already forming inside his own mind. Somewhere out there existed a woman who had given birth to both of them on the same night, and somehow lost both children under circumstances neither understood. Had she abandoned them willingly? Had she been lied to? Had she spent decades searching without answers? Did she even know they existed separately? Questions began multiplying faster than either could process them. Yet what neither realized was that asking questions about their mother would place them directly on a path toward discovering truths far more disturbing than simple family separation. Because buried inside the Bennett case was one final secret nobody connected to St. Catherine Medical Center could allow Claire and Ethan to uncover. Their separation had never been about adoption paperwork alone. Someone had paid enormous amounts of money specifically requesting one of those twins. And the reason behind that request remained hidden inside hospital records so dangerous that certain people were now prepared to do absolutely anything necessary to keep those answers buried forever. What Claire and Ethan still did not know was that by discovering they were twins, they had just become the single greatest threat to secrets powerful people had spent nearly 30 years protecting. And somewhere, plans were already being set into motion to make sure their search for answers ended before they reached the truth about what really happened the night they were born. The human mind has a remarkable way of protecting itself when confronted with truths too painful to accept all at once. For several hours after leaving the genetics laboratory, Claire Bennett and Ethan Bennett existed in a strange emotional suspension where neither fully understood how to process what had just happened. 28 years of separate lives had suddenly collapsed into a single devastating revelation powerful enough to erase everything they believed about their own identities. The bitterness they had carried toward one another now felt almost unbearable to remember. Every cruel exchange, every accusation, every deliberate attempt to destroy the other's career. Looking back now, both were forced to confront a truth far heavier than simple regret. The person they had spent the past year emotionally tearing apart was the one individual in the world whose existence should have been tied to theirs from the very first second of life. Instead, someone had deliberately stolen that connection before either of them ever had the chance to know it existed. For Claire, the pain carried an especially cruel weight. Her entire childhood had been shaped by unanswered questions surrounding abandonment. For years she had convinced herself that somewhere, a mother had willingly given her away, choosing a life without her for reasons Claire could never understand. That silent question had followed her into adulthood, shaping relationships, trust, self-worth, and a quiet fear of emotional rejection she rarely admitted even to herself. But now everything she believed had begun shifting violently. If she and Ethan had been born together, then this was no ordinary adoption story. No mother gives birth to twins, and somehow one child disappears without explanation while the other enters legal adoption processing under suspicious paperwork. Something far more complicated had happened inside St. Catherine Medical Center that night. For the first time in her life, Claire found herself considering a possibility she had never allowed before. Perhaps she had never been abandoned at all. Ethan was confronting a different kind of collapse. Unlike Claire, he had never known adoption played any role in his childhood. His parents, Robert and Susan Bennett, had raised him believing he was their biological son from birth. He had lived 28 years never questioning his family history because nobody had ever given him reason to doubt it. But now every memory connected to his childhood suddenly demanded re-examination. Why had his birth certificate been legally reissued 6 months after birth? Why had certain family photographs from infancy always been strangely absent? Why had his mother grown visibly uncomfortable any time medical history conversations surfaced during family gatherings? Looking backward, details he had ignored for decades now carried entirely different meaning. The foundation beneath his entire life had cracked open, revealing the possibility that even the people who raised him may have known far more than they ever admitted. Late that evening, sitting together inside Claire's apartment surrounded by hospital paperwork spread across the dining table, both reached the same conclusion independently. Before confronting anyone connected to their adoptive families, they needed answers about the woman who had brought them into the world. Somewhere there had to be records connected to their biological mother. A name, medical files, historical records predating the suspicious adoption paperwork. Claire immediately contacted the private investigator who had helped uncover her adoption anomalies and requested full background tracing connected to all hospital intake documentation from May 19, 1994. Ethan did the same through his investigator. For the first time since meeting, the two were no longer working against each other. They had become partners in uncovering the truth stolen from them before either had the ability to understand what had been taken. But 3 states away, Richard Mercer understood exactly where their investigation would lead next. And that terrified him. He had spent much of the afternoon reviewing archived case notes he had not touched in nearly 30 years. The Bennett case remained among the most dangerous records connected to St. Catherine Medical Center's unauthorized infant transfer operation, because unlike other cases handled quietly during those years, this particular birth involved a mother who had refused cooperation. Richard remembered that night vividly now. The young woman had arrived alone, already under significant emotional distress. Financial hardship had pushed her to the edge long before labor began, but unlike other vulnerable mothers, hospital administrators quietly manipulated into private adoption agreements. She had made one demand with absolute clarity. No matter what happened financially, she intended to keep both children. Richard remembered those exact words because several hours later, everything changed. Her name was Rebecca Bennett, 23 years old. Recently abandoned by the twins' biological father during late pregnancy complications. She arrived at St. Catherine Medical Center exhausted, emotionally fragile, and carrying nearly impossible financial burdens. Yet despite those circumstances, Rebecca fought fiercely against every suggestion hospital staff made regarding temporary custody arrangements following delivery complications. According to archived notes Richard now held in his hands, labor became medically complicated shortly after midnight. Emergency interventions were required. Significant blood loss followed during delivery. Rebecca lost consciousness shortly after both infants were born. It was during those chaotic hours that several hospital administrators made decisions they would spend decades hiding. Because unknown to Rebecca, powerful individuals connected to a private adoption network operating quietly through the hospital had already expressed extraordinary interest in acquiring one newborn child connected to a wealthy couple unable to adopt through traditional legal channels. Ordinarily, infants transferred through these private arrangements involved single births under circumstances allowing relatively simple documentation alterations. But that night presented unusual complications. The wealthy couple financing the arrangement had specifically requested a newborn male infant, Ethan, yet Rebecca had delivered twins. Hospital administrators immediately recognized a dangerous problem. If both infants remained together, separating one child without the mother discovering the truth would become nearly impossible once she regained consciousness. Heated discussions erupted privately among senior staff, while Rebecca remained sedated following delivery trauma. Margaret Holloway had been among those administrators present that night. Richard Mercer himself had arrived shortly after receiving emergency legal consultation requests from hospital leadership. What happened next remained the single decision haunting everyone involved for decades afterward. A choice was made under circumstances none of them could ever reverse. Ethan was quietly removed from official birth registration records before Rebecca regained consciousness. Preliminary hospital intake documents listing twin births were intercepted before reaching county filing systems. Administrative staff began rewriting paperwork immediately. When Rebecca finally woke hours later, still weak from blood loss and heavily medicated, she was informed she had delivered only one surviving child, Claire. Hospital staff explained that severe complications during labor had resulted in the second infant dying shortly after birth. According to archived testimony Richard now reread with trembling hands, Rebecca became hysterical immediately. She demanded to see medical reports. She demanded proof. She begged repeatedly to hold the child she had supposedly lost. Hospital staff refused, claiming emergency procedures had already transferred remains for mandatory pathology review due to delivery complications. It was a lie carefully coordinated in real time, while Ethan was already being transported out of the hospital under private transfer authorization. But what happened next created problems none of them anticipated. Rebecca refused discharge procedures entirely. For nearly 48 hours, she demanded access to full delivery documentation and repeatedly challenged inconsistencies inside explanations hospital staff provided regarding the supposed death of her second child. Margaret Holloway later admitted privately that Rebecca's persistence terrified everyone involved. She sensed immediately that something about the hospital's explanation was deeply wrong. Administrators feared police involvement if Rebecca pursued formal legal complaints. So another decision was made. Claire, the remaining infant, would be pushed rapidly through legal adoption channels before Rebecca recovered sufficiently to begin formal custody proceedings. Emergency surrender paperwork was forged. Rebecca's signatures were duplicated using consent forms obtained during initial hospital admission. Within 72 hours, Claire entered expedited adoption placement under legal documentation falsely indicating voluntary maternal surrender. But hospital administrators made one critical mistake. They underestimated Rebecca Bennett completely. The moment she regained physical strength, she returned demanding answers with even greater determination than before. She refused to accept explanations surrounding the alleged death of one child and sudden disappearance of the other. She filed complaints with state medical review boards. She contacted local attorneys. She attempted obtaining sealed hospital records independently. For several weeks, St. Catherine Medical Center faced the real possibility that their unauthorized infant transfer operation might collapse entirely under legal scrutiny. Richard Mercer spent months coordinating damage control responses designed specifically to discredit Rebecca publicly. Her complaints were dismissed as emotional instability connected to traumatic childbirth complications. Hospital records supporting her claims mysteriously vanished. Witness statements changed. Administrative logs disappeared. Eventually, exhausted financially and emotionally isolated, Rebecca's efforts collapsed. For years afterward, Rebecca Bennett continued searching quietly for answers nobody would give her. Richard knew this because hospital administrators maintained periodic monitoring whenever she attempted reopening inquiries connected to that night. She wrote letters to state agencies, requested medical records repeatedly, contacted journalists several times hoping someone would examine inconsistencies surrounding her delivery. But without proof, nobody listened. Gradually, public records surrounding her efforts disappeared into forgotten bureaucratic archives where officials assumed the matter had ended permanently. Over time, everyone connected to the case convinced themselves Rebecca would eventually stop searching. Most believed she had simply disappeared somewhere beyond Illinois years later. No one bothered investigating further. The secret appeared safe. Back in New York, Claire's investigator called just after midnight, carrying information neither Claire nor Ethan were emotionally prepared to hear. He had successfully traced archived pre-adoption hospital intake records connected to maternal registration files from May 19, 1994. Biological mother identification had finally surfaced. The name attached to both hospital records was Rebecca Bennett. Claire immediately wrote the name down while Ethan stared silently across the room, trying to absorb what this meant. For the first time in their lives, they finally had the name of the woman who had brought them into the world. Yet before relief could settle in, the investigator continued speaking. Preliminary public record searches suggested Rebecca Bennett had spent years filing repeated legal complaints against St. Catherine Medical Center shortly after their birth. Complaints specifically connected to allegations involving missing newborn records and unauthorized infant removal. The room fell completely silent. Claire slowly lowered the phone. Ethan's face had gone pale. In that moment, both understood something with terrifying clarity. Their mother had never abandoned them. She had been fighting for them. She had known. She had spent years trying to bring them home. And someone had stolen both children while convincing the world she had imagined everything. But the next words from the investigator would hit even harder. He had located Rebecca Bennett's most recent public records. And according to state registration archives, Rebecca Bennett had died 6 years earlier. She had gone to her grave never knowing what happened to either of her children. Neither Claire nor Ethan spoke for nearly a full minute. Because suddenly, this story was no longer about discovering identity. It had become something else entirely. Someone had destroyed an innocent woman's life. And now the 2 children she spent years desperately trying to recover had finally discovered the truth. What Claire and Ethan didn't realize yet was that Rebecca Bennett had left something behind before she died. Something powerful enough to expose everything. And several people connected to St. Catherine Medical Center were already moving quickly to find it before Claire and Ethan ever could. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from losing someone you never had the chance to know. For Claire Bennett and Ethan Bennett, discovering that their biological mother had died years earlier created a grief unlike anything either had experienced before. Most people mourn memories, shared moments, laughter, conversations, years spent building connection with someone they love. But this was different. Claire and Ethan were mourning possibility itself. They were grieving decades that had been stolen before those decades ever had the chance to exist. Somewhere in another version of life, Rebecca Bennett had raised both children herself. There would have been birthdays spent together, family photographs, arguments over trivial things, holidays shared around crowded dinner tables, memories built over time like every ordinary family takes for granted. Instead, someone had severed that future in a hospital room nearly 30 years earlier and forced 3 separate lives onto completely different paths. And now the woman who had spent years trying to recover her children had died believing she failed. Claire took Rebecca's death harder than Ethan expected. Throughout most of her adult life, she had quietly carried unresolved anger toward the woman she believed abandoned her. Every difficult relationship, every fear surrounding emotional trust, every lingering insecurity about self-worth had roots connected to one painful assumption she had believed for nearly 3 decades. She believed her mother had chosen life without her. But now, learning that Rebecca Bennett had spent years desperately fighting against hospital administrators trying to recover both children shattered that entire belief system instantly. Claire found herself confronting a truth almost impossible to bear. The woman she had blamed her entire life had been innocent. Worse still, Rebecca had died without ever knowing her daughter understood that. Somewhere inside old legal complaints, unanswered letters, forgotten state filings, and records buried beneath decades of silence, existed evidence proving Rebecca Bennett never stopped trying to bring her children home. Claire sat motionless for nearly an hour, unable to stop imagining how lonely those final years must have been. Ethan's reaction moved in a different direction. Where Claire felt grief, Ethan felt rage unlike anything he had known before. Every detail they had uncovered now painted a horrifying picture impossible to ignore. His entire life had been purchased. There was no other way to describe it. Someone had paid enormous money specifically requesting a male infant, and hospital administrators had responded by taking him directly from his biological mother while fabricating a false death story to cover their actions. The implications hit him brutally. His childhood memories, his parents, his surname, his identity, the family history he grew up believing belonged to him. All of it now sat beneath a terrifying question he could no longer avoid asking. Had Robert and Susan Bennett knowingly participated in acquiring him through illegal means? Or had they themselves been manipulated by people running the private adoption network inside St. Catherine Medical Center? Ethan desperately wanted to believe the second possibility, but a growing part of him feared answers waiting ahead would be far worse. The following afternoon, Claire's investigator called again, carrying information connected to Rebecca Bennett's final years. Before her death, Rebecca had spent almost 2 decades living quietly in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, working several low-paying administrative jobs while periodically reopening inquiries connected to St. Catherine Medical Center. Public records showed repeated requests for archived hospital documentation stretching across nearly 15 years. Most requests were denied or quietly delayed until deadlines expired. But roughly 8 months before her death, Rebecca had made one final move nobody connected to the hospital understood at the time. She hired an independent legal archivist specializing in sealed medical record recovery. According to payment records obtained through estate filings, Rebecca spent nearly every remaining dollar she had saved paying this archivist to reconstruct hospital administrative activity surrounding May 19, 1994. Then, only 3 weeks later, she died unexpectedly from cardiac arrest. Her investigation stopped instantly. The archivist disappeared from all publicly available records shortly afterward. That detail immediately caught Claire's attention. People do not simply vanish after being hired to investigate hospital misconduct connected to illegal adoption activity. Something about the timing felt deeply wrong. Ethan agreed instantly. Rebecca had spent decades chasing answers without success. Yet the moment she hired someone capable of uncovering sealed administrative records, both the investigation and the investigator vanished within weeks. Neither needed much imagination to understand what this suggested. Someone had likely been monitoring Rebecca for years, allowing her harmless complaints to continue only because she lacked evidence strong enough to threaten anyone directly. But the moment her search moved dangerously close to real documentation, events changed quickly. Claire immediately instructed the investigator to identify the missing archivist. If Rebecca uncovered something significant before her death, that information could still exist somewhere. 300 miles away in Illinois, Richard Mercer had already begun his own search. Unlike Claire and Ethan, Richard knew precisely why Rebecca's final investigation mattered. Months before her death, Rebecca had managed to locate a retired records technician formerly employed at St. Catherine Medical Center during the early 1990s. The technician, facing terminal illness at the time, had privately admitted that original internal delivery logs from May 19, 1994 were never destroyed as hospital administrators believed. Instead, fearing legal consequences years earlier, he secretly copied sensitive administrative files connected to dozens of unauthorized infant transfer cases and stored them privately. Among those files existed complete documentation surrounding Rebecca Bennett's delivery, internal authorization signatures approving Ethan's transfer, financial transaction records connected to the wealthy couple requesting a male infant, and emergency legal correspondence proving hospital administrators knowingly falsified Rebecca's medical records. Richard learned about these hidden documents only after Rebecca hired the archivist to track them down. Since then, one objective had consumed him entirely: locate those files before anyone else. Late that evening, Claire received another unexpected call, this time from a woman introducing herself as Eleanor Pierce. Her voice sounded cautious, almost nervous, as though speaking carried consequences she deeply feared. Eleanor explained that she had worked as Rebecca Bennett's landlord in Milwaukee during the final 7 years of Rebecca's life. Following news reports quietly circulating through local record access systems regarding renewed inquiries connected to St. Catherine Medical Center, Eleanor had begun searching Rebecca's old tenancy records and discovered instructions Rebecca left months before her death. If anyone ever came looking for information connected to her missing children, Eleanor was to deliver a package Rebecca specifically prepared years earlier. Claire immediately stopped breathing for several seconds. Ethan stared across the room, understanding instantly what this meant. Rebecca had expected someone might eventually uncover the truth. The package remained locked inside a small storage facility outside Milwaukee under Eleanor's supervision. Rebecca had paid years in advance, specifically ensuring nobody accessed the contents without authorization tied to her biological children. Eleanor admitted she never fully understood why Rebecca treated the storage unit with such extreme secrecy. Over the years, Rebecca had spoken often about 2 children taken from her unfairly, but few people believed her story. Most assumed grief connected to childbirth trauma had affected her emotionally. Yet Rebecca remained completely consistent for decades. She never changed details, never contradicted herself, never stopped insisting powerful people inside St. Catherine Medical Center had stolen both her children while destroying her life in the process. Eleanor confessed something quietly that immediately changed everything for Claire and Ethan. Shortly before dying, Rebecca told her one sentence Eleanor never forgot. She said, "Someday my children will find each other, and when they do, everything hidden will finally come apart." Neither Claire nor Ethan hesitated. The following morning, they booked immediate flights to Milwaukee. Whatever Rebecca left behind could contain the answers they had spent weeks desperately searching for. Yet neither realized others were already moving toward the same destination. Less than 40 minutes after Claire ended the call with Eleanor Pierce, her phone records were intercepted through private surveillance systems still accessible to individuals connected to Richard Mercer's old network. The name Eleanor Pierce triggered immediate alarm. Richard understood exactly what this meant. Rebecca had anticipated dying before uncovering the truth herself and prepared evidence intended specifically for Claire and Ethan if they ever discovered who they were. If that package contained even partial documentation proving hospital administrators knowingly separated the twins illegally, decades of carefully buried secrets could collapse overnight. Worse still, investigators might begin reopening hundreds of similar cases connected to St. Catherine Medical Center's unauthorized infant transfer network. Richard acted immediately. 2 private security contractors employed quietly through one of his consulting firms were dispatched toward Milwaukee with direct instructions. Retrieve Rebecca Bennett's stored materials before Claire and Ethan reached the location. If Eleanor Pierce refused cooperation, alternative pressure methods were authorized. Richard sat silently after ending the calls, fully understanding events had reached a point where ordinary damage control no longer mattered. For nearly 30 years, he and others connected to the hospital had survived because evidence remained fragmented, incomplete, impossible to connect directly. But Rebecca Bennett had always represented the one variable nobody fully controlled. Unlike others affected by hospital operations during those years, Rebecca never accepted official explanations. She kept digging, kept documenting inconsistencies, kept preserving records even when nobody believed her. And now, even after death, she remained dangerously close to exposing everything. Meanwhile, flying west toward Milwaukee, Claire sat staring out the aircraft window, clutching the only photograph investigators had recovered of Rebecca Bennett taken less than 2 years before her death. The woman staring back carried visible signs of a difficult life. Lines carved deeply around tired eyes, shoulders burdened by years of exhaustion. Yet something about the face immediately unsettled Claire emotionally. The resemblance was undeniable. Same eyes, same facial structure, same expression Claire herself unconsciously carried during moments of stress. Across the aisle, Ethan kept glancing repeatedly at the photograph, unable to ignore similarities connecting all 3 of them. For the first time in his life, he was staring directly at the woman whose life had been shattered the moment strangers decided he no longer belonged to her. But what neither sibling knew was that another plane had already landed in Milwaukee nearly 20 minutes earlier. Richard Mercer's men were already moving toward Eleanor Pierce. And inside Rebecca Bennett's hidden storage locker sat something far more dangerous than either Claire or Ethan imagined. Because Rebecca had not only preserved evidence proving what happened the night her children were born, she had also uncovered the identity of the wealthy couple who paid specifically to take Ethan. the people who bought him. And one of those names was connected to someone still holding enormous power even now. The moment Claire and Ethan opened that package, this story would stop being about family secrets. It would become something powerful people would do absolutely anything to keep buried.